I remember the exact sound the belt made when my son pulled it from his pants. A slow leather whisper sliding through the loops, shhhh, like a snake moving through dry leaves. Even now, years later, that sound still makes my stomach twist. My name is Emily Carter. I am 66 years old, a retired school teacher, and that afternoon I stood in my own kitchen staring at my son while he held a belt in his hand and told me to sign a document that would give him everything I owned. My house, my savings, my independence, my whole life. Behind him stood my daughter-in-law Linda, leaning against the wall with her arms folded and a small, amused smile on her face. She let out a quiet laugh. Ha ha ha, oh Emily, don't be so dramatic. Dramatic, that word echoed in my ears like a slap. I looked down at the paper on the table. My hands trembled so badly I could barely hold the pen. Michael stepped closer. I could smell alcohol on his breath. Mom, he said slowly, his voice tight, just sign it, stop making this difficult. I looked at his face, searching for the boy I raised, the boy who used to run into my arms after school. But the eyes staring back at me were cold, impatient, and that belt wrapped around his fist like a warning. Linda sighed loudly behind him. Come on, Emily, she said in that sugary voice she used when she wanted something. Once you sign it, everything will finally be settled. The house, the accounts, everything will be ours. Ours. I felt something crack deep inside my chest when she said that, my house. The house I bought with 40 years of teaching children how to read and write, the house where my husband died, the house where my son learned to walk. Ours. Ha ha ha, life has a strange sense of humor, doesn't it? Sometimes the people who promise to protect you are the ones standing in front of you demanding everything you have. I swallowed hard, my throat felt dry like sand. Michael, why are you doing this? I whispered. For a second his jaw tightened. Because you leave me no choice. No choice, that phrase made my heart sink even deeper. I looked again at the belt in his hand. I never imagined, never, that one day my own child would stand in front of me like that. But here is the truth most people don't like to admit. Family betrayals rarely happen suddenly. They grow slowly, quietly, like cracks in a wall you ignore until the whole thing collapses. And if you're listening right now, maybe you're wondering the same thing I did in that moment. How does a mother end up afraid of her own son? Believe me, I asked myself that question again and again. The truth is, this story didn't start in that kitchen. No, it started many years earlier when my life looked completely different. Back then, my world was simple. My husband Richard worked long shifts in a textile factory while I taught second grade at the public school downtown. We were not rich, not even close, but our small house was always full of warmth. Every morning smelled like coffee and cinnamon rolls. Richard would sit at the kitchen table reading the newspaper while Michael, still in his pajamas, talked endlessly about his dreams. Mom, he once said with chocolate milk on his upper lip, when I grow up I'm going to buy you a giant house with a swimming pool. Ha ha ha, children say the sweetest things. I would laugh and brush his hair back. I don't need a giant house, sweetheart, I just need you to grow up kind. Richard would chuckle behind his newspaper. You'll see, Emily, he said many times, this boy will take care of you one day, and I believed him with my whole heart. Sundays were our favorite days. We went to church in the morning, always sitting in the same pew, and afterwards we walked through the town square while Michael chased pigeons. Sometimes Richard squeezed my hand and whispered, this right here is happiness. And I always nodded because it truly felt like it, but life doesn't stay the same forever. Sometimes it changes quietly when you least expect it. Michael was 17 when Richard got sick. At first it seemed small, just a little chest pain, a little dizziness. The doctor said it might be stress, but within weeks we were spending more time in hospital waiting rooms than at home. I still remember the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of machines. One afternoon sunlight streamed through the hospital window while Richard held my hand. His fingers felt colder than usual. Emily, he whispered. I leaned closer. Yes, my love. His eyes moved toward the hallway where Michael had just left, saying he had homework and couldn't stay long. Richard sighed softly. Promise me something. Anything, I said without hesitation. His voice grew weaker. Take care of our son, but don't spoil him too much. That boy needs to learn that life hurts. At the time those words confused me. Why would he say that? Michael was a good boy, kind, loving, or at least that's what I believed. 2 weeks later, Richard passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning. I remember standing beside his hospital bed, holding his hand long after the machines had stopped. The world felt empty and silent except for one thought repeating in my head. I promised him I would take care of our son, and I kept that promise maybe too well. I worked harder than ever after Richard died. Extra tutoring after school, baking cakes on weekends to sell at the market. Every dollar I saved went toward Michael's future. College tuition, books, rent, I never complained. He was my son, my only child. But slowly little things began to change. Michael stopped sitting with me at breakfast. He spent more time in his room with the door closed. When I knocked, he answered through the wood. I'm fine, Mom, always the same words. always without opening the door. I told myself it was normal. Teenagers need space, right? That's what everyone said, but there were other signs too, small things I ignored. He began asking for money more often, for clothes, for trips with friends, for things he said he needed, and every time I said yes, because whenever I looked at him, I still saw the little boy chasing pigeons in the square. I believed love meant giving, always giving. I didn't realize that sometimes giving too much slowly teaches people to take everything. Years later, I would remember those moments and sigh deeply, wishing I had understood earlier. Because if I had, maybe I would have stopped what came next. And what came next started the day my son brought a woman named Linda into our lives. But before I tell you about her, there's something important you should understand about that moment in my kitchen with the belt, because what happened after that would change everything. And it all began with a single sound that none of us expected, the doorbell. The first time I saw Linda, something inside me felt uneasy. I can't explain it properly. Have you ever met someone and felt a quiet warning deep in your chest? Not something obvious, not something you can prove, just a soft whisper in your mind saying, "Be careful." That was exactly how I felt when Michael brought her to my graduation party for him. It was a warm evening in our backyard. I had hung small lights between the trees, and the smell of grilled chicken and lemonade filled the air. Neighbors were laughing, music was playing, and for a moment I truly believed life was finally becoming peaceful again after Richard's death. Then Michael walked through the gate with a tall blonde woman beside him. "Mom," he said casually, "this is Linda." She stepped forward wearing a tight white dress and very high heels that clicked against the wooden deck. Her nails were long and painted a bright red that reminded me of tiny drops of blood. She smiled politely and leaned forward as if to kiss the air beside my cheek. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Carter," she said sweetly. Sweet but somehow empty. I smiled back anyway. Mothers do that. We welcome the people our children bring home even when our instincts whisper otherwise. "It's nice to meet you too, dear," I said. For the rest of the evening she stayed close to Michael's side, laughing loudly at his jokes, touching his arm every few minutes. Sometimes I caught her looking around my house in a strange way, not with admiration, but with calculation. As if she were measuring things in her head. The furniture, the kitchen, the backyard. At the time I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe I was just nervous about my son growing up. But later that night, after the party ended and the guests left, Michael helped me carry dishes into the kitchen. Plates clinked in the sink while the smell of lemonade still lingered in the warm air. I was about to thank him for helping when he suddenly said something that made my hands freeze. "Mom, Linda and I are getting married." The glass slipped from my fingers and shattered against the floor. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. "Married?" I whispered. "Already?" Michael shrugged casually as if he had just told me he was going to the grocery store. "Yeah, we've been talking about it for a while." For a few seconds I couldn't speak. I looked at my son's face and suddenly remembered Richard's voice in the hospital. "Take care of our son, but don't spoil him too much." I pushed that memory away quickly and forced a small smile. "Do you love her?" I asked softly. Michael hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Of course I do." That tiny pause should have told me everything, but love makes people blind sometimes, especially a mother's love. I bent down to pick up the broken glass pieces from the floor and one sharp edge cut my finger. A small drop of blood fell onto the kitchen towel. "Are you okay, Mom?" Michael asked quickly. "I'm fine," I said with a little sigh. "I just want you to be happy." And that was the truth. I wanted my son to have a good life. I wanted him to build a family of his own. I just didn't realize how much that decision would eventually cost me. The wedding happened the following summer. June, a month that usually brings sunshine and blue skies, but that day the sky was gray and rain fell slowly against the church windows. I sat in the first pew wearing a navy blue dress I had bought on sale. I remember holding my purse tightly while guests filled the church. Most of them were strangers, Linda's friends, Linda's relatives, people who laughed loudly and spoke as if they had known my son forever. Beside me sat Mrs. Robinson, my neighbor for nearly 30 years. She squeezed my hand gently and whispered, "Your boy looks handsome." I nodded and forced a smile. Just like his father, when Linda finally entered the church, everyone turned to stare. Her dress was enormous, covered in glittering stones, with a train so long 2 little girls had to carry it behind her. She walked slowly down the aisle like she was on a runway, smiling proudly at the guests, but she never looked at Michael, not once. I noticed that immediately. Michael stood at the altar waiting, his hands shaking slightly. When the priest asked if he accepted Linda as his wife, there was a pause, only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt like an eternity. "I do," he said finally, his voice low. Linda smiled widely and the ceremony continued. Afterward, we moved to a large reception hall filled with flowers and music. There were over 100 guests. I knew maybe 20 of them. My seat was at a small table near the back of the room, while Michael and Linda sat at the center table surrounded by her family. One of my coworkers leaned toward me and whispered, "Shouldn't you be sitting up there with them?" I smiled politely and shook my head. "Oh no, I'm fine here," but the truth was simple. No one had invited me to sit at the main table. Halfway through dinner, Linda stood up and grabbed the microphone. The music stopped and everyone turned toward her. She raised her glass of champagne and began speaking. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate our special day," she said, "especially my wonderful family who helped make this wedding possible." Applause filled the room. Then she paused and added with a small laugh, "And of course I want to thank my mother-in-law Emily, who helped with a few little expenses for the tables." A few little expenses. I had paid for nearly the entire wedding, the venue, the flowers, the food, but I simply smiled from my seat while people turned to look at me politely. Mrs. Robinson squeezed my hand under the table and whispered softly, "Just breathe, honey." I nodded slowly and forced another smile. Sometimes dignity means staying silent even when your heart feels heavy. That night after the party ended, Michael and Linda left early for their honeymoon in Hawaii. They didn't say goodbye. They simply waved from the car window while the rain continued to fall on the empty parking lot. The next morning I received a short message from Michael. "We arrived safely. Talk later," but they didn't call, not that day, not the next. 2 weeks later, when they returned, I decided to surprise them. I went to the small apartment they had rented and spent the whole day cleaning it. I painted the walls, washed the windows, hung new curtains, and filled the refrigerator with food. When they arrived that evening, Linda looked around the apartment with an expression that was strange, not grateful, not happy, more like annoyed. "Oh, mother-in-law," she said with a small sigh, "you didn't have to do all this." "It was no trouble," I replied gently. "I just wanted you both to start your new life comfortably." Michael looked around quietly with his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, thanks, Mom," but he didn't hug me, he didn't even look me in the eyes. And standing there in that freshly cleaned apartment, I suddenly felt something I couldn't explain. A small cold feeling like the first drop of rain before a storm. At the time I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking again. After all, families go through adjustments, right? But sometimes the smallest moments carry the biggest warnings. And the real problems, the ones that would slowly destroy everything between us, hadn't even started yet. Because only a few months later my son knocked on my door late one afternoon with a look on his face I had never seen before, and the first words he said made my heart drop straight into my stomach. "Mom, I need money." The first time Michael asked me for money, I didn't think much about it. After all, parents help their children all the time, right? That's what I told myself when he sat on my living room sofa one afternoon, rubbing his face nervously while avoiding my eyes. The sun was coming through the window behind him, lighting the dust in the air, and for a moment he looked like the same tired boy who used to fall asleep on the couch after school. "Mom, I need a little help," he said quietly. I smiled gently and poured him a cup of coffee. "Of course, sweetheart, what happened?" He hesitated before answering. "Linda, she used the credit cards a lot, clothes, furniture, things for the apartment." We didn't realize how fast the balance was growing. He laughed nervously, a short, awkward heh yeah. Then he finally looked up at me. "We just need $10,000 to cover everything. $10,000. For a second the number floated in the air between us like smoke. That was almost 3 months of my salary at the school. I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. "Michael, that's a lot of money," I said softly. He leaned forward quickly, his voice suddenly urgent. "I know, Mom, I know, but you have savings. I remember you telling Dad once you were putting money aside." I sighed quietly. Yes, I had savings. Years of careful budgeting, years of small sacrifices. That money was supposed to be for retirement, for the day when I could finally stop working and rest a little. But then I looked at my son. His shoulders were tense, his hands shaking slightly, and in that moment I remembered Richard's last request in the hospital: "Take care of our son." My heart softened immediately. "All right," I whispered after a moment. "I'll help you." Michael's face brightened instantly. "Really?" he said, almost jumping from the couch. I nodded slowly. "Yes, but you need to be more careful, sweetheart." He stood up and hugged me quickly. It wasn't a long hug, but it was enough to warm my heart. "Thank you, Mom. I promise I'll pay you back." That promise, I would hear it many times later, and like many promises in life, it sounded sincere in the moment. The next day I went to the bank and withdrew the money. When I handed the envelope to Michael, he took it quickly, almost nervously. "You're saving us," he said with relief, but he didn't look me in the eyes, and he never paid me back. At first I told myself it didn't matter. Families help each other. That's what love means. But 2 months later he came back again. This time he knocked on my door late in the evening. I opened it and immediately noticed how tired he looked, dark circles under his eyes, his shirt wrinkled. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked quietly. My heart sank a little because somehow I already knew what was coming. We sat in the kitchen while the kettle heated water for tea. "What happened this time?" I asked gently. He rubbed his temples and sighed deeply. "It's Linda again. She keeps buying things, clothes, decorations, furniture." She says the apartment doesn't feel like a real home yet. I waited silently, then he said the words I feared. We need another 5,000. I closed my eyes for a second and took a slow breath. 5,000 more. My savings were shrinking quickly, but again I looked at my son and again my heart melted. Okay, I said quietly, and just like before he promised to repay me. Months passed like that, 5,000 here, 2,000 there. Every time he arrived with the same worried face, the same nervous voice. And every time I helped him, because what else was I supposed to do? Let my son struggle, let him drown in debt? Of course not. Mothers don't work that way. We give. We support, we forgive. But slowly, almost without noticing, something strange began happening. Michael didn't visit just to see me anymore. Every conversation seemed to end with money. Sometimes Linda came with him, standing behind him silently while he asked. She would smile politely and say things like, "We'll pay you back soon, Emily." But there was always something cold in her eyes when she looked around my house. One afternoon she walked through the living room slowly, touching the wooden shelves and glancing toward the backyard. "This is a lovely house," she said thoughtfully. "So much space." I smiled politely. "Yes. Richard and I bought it when Michael was born." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the walls, the furniture, the windows, as if she were imagining something. I didn't understand it then, but looking back now, I realized she wasn't admiring the house. She was studying it, measuring it, calculating, and then one Saturday afternoon everything changed. Michael and Linda arrived together, both of them serious. No smiles, no small talk. "Mom, we need to talk," Michael said as soon as they stepped inside. My stomach tightened instantly. "Of course," I replied. "Do you want coffee?" "No," Linda said quickly. "This will only take a moment." They sat in the living room across from me. Michael cleared his throat while Linda crossed her legs calmly. "Mom, we've been thinking about the house," he began. I frowned slightly. "The house?" Linda nodded and placed her hand gently on her stomach. I hadn't noticed before, but her blouse looked slightly loose around her waist. "Yes," she said softly, "because soon we'll need more space." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Michael smiled nervously. "Linda is pregnant." For a second the world went silent. Pregnant, my first grandchild. I should have felt joy, excitement, happiness. Instead, I felt something else. A strange, cold fear creeping into my chest. "Congratulations," I said slowly. Linda smiled sweetly. "Thank you, mother-in-law." Then she leaned forward slightly and said something that changed everything. "That's why we thought it would make sense if you moved into our apartment, and we moved here." The words hit me like a sudden gust of cold wind. "Move here," I repeated quietly. Michael nodded quickly. "Yeah, Mom, think about it. This house is huge for just one person." I looked around the room slowly. Every wall held a memory. Richard reading the newspaper, Michael learning to ride his bicycle in the hallway, Christmas mornings beside the fireplace. "But this is my home," I said softly. Linda sighed dramatically. "Oh, Emily, don't make it sound like we're taking something from you. It's just practical." Michael leaned forward and touched my knee. "It's for the baby, Mom, the baby." My granddaughter, the word hung in the air like a quiet pressure. I didn't answer immediately. I simply stared at the floor, feeling the ground beneath my life slowly shifting. And deep inside my chest, I heard Richard's voice again from that hospital room years earlier. "Take care of our son, but don't spoil him too much." The problem was, by then it was already too late. And what my son asked for next would prove just how late it was. I sat there quietly after Michael said it, staring at the floor while the words echoed inside my head. Move into their apartment and let them live in my house. The idea felt strange, almost unreal. This house wasn't just a building. It was my life. Every wall carried a memory. The kitchen where Michael learned to bake cookies with me. The hallway where Richard once tried to fix a broken lamp and nearly fell off the ladder while laughing, saying, "Well, that didn't go as planned." Even the little scratch on the dining table reminded me of the day Michael tried to carve his initials into the wood when he was 10. I smiled faintly remembering that, but the smile faded quickly when I looked back at the two people sitting in front of me. "Michael," I said slowly, "this house is mine. I worked 40 years to pay for it." He nodded quickly as if he expected that answer. "Of course it's yours, Mom. No one is taking it away from you." Linda crossed her arms and added with a small laugh, "Exactly. We're just talking about living arrangements." Living arrangements. That phrase sounded so simple, yet something about it made my stomach tighten. "You could move into our apartment," Michael continued, leaning closer. "It's smaller, easier to maintain, and here we would have space for the baby. 3 bedrooms, a backyard. It's perfect. Perfect." I looked around the living room again. The curtains moved gently in the afternoon breeze coming through the window. I could almost hear Richard's voice somewhere in the quiet of the house. "Be careful." I swallowed and forced a calm smile. "Let me think about it." Linda's expression changed immediately. The sweet smile vanished for a moment and something sharp appeared behind her eyes. "Think about it," she repeated slowly. Michael quickly tried to smooth the tension. "It's okay, Mom, take your time." But his voice sounded different. Slightly colder, they left shortly after that conversation, and the house felt strangely empty once the door closed behind them. I walked slowly through each room that evening, touching the walls as if I needed to remind myself the place was still mine. The bedroom where Richard and I slept for 30 years, the kitchen table where we shared thousands of breakfasts, the small garden outside where I planted lilac bushes the year Michael was born. I sat down in the kitchen and sighed deeply. "What am I supposed to do, Richard?" I whispered to the empty room. Of course, there was no answer. 3 weeks passed before they mentioned the house again, 3 weeks where every morning I woke up thinking about the same question. Should I give it to them? Should I move out? My heart said I should help my son, but something deeper, something older, kept warning me that this decision was bigger than it seemed. Then one afternoon Michael and Linda arrived again, this time without warning. Linda wore a loose pink blouse and her belly was starting to show slightly. Michael carried a yellow folder under his arm. "Mom, we have good news," he said as he walked into the living room. I smiled politely. "More good news?" Linda sat down carefully and placed her hand on her stomach with a proud little smile. "We found out the baby is a girl, my granddaughter." For a moment my heart softened and I felt the warm flutter of happiness I had expected weeks earlier. "That's wonderful," I said. "Congratulations." Michael placed the yellow folder on the coffee table and opened it. Papers slid out neatly across the surface. "We talked to a lawyer," he explained. "He told us the easiest way to handle everything is if you give me a power of attorney." The words made me blink in confusion. "A power of attorney?" Linda nodded quickly. "Yes, mother-in-law. That way Michael can manage the house properly, renovations, paperwork, things like that." I looked down at the papers. Lines of legal language filled the pages. My head started spinning slightly. "Why would you need that?" I asked slowly. Michael smiled reassuringly. "Just to make things easier. If the house stays in your name, we'll need permits for every little change. This way I can handle everything." Linda leaned forward and tapped the paper with one red nail. "Think of it as helping your granddaughter." There it was again, the baby. Every argument somehow led back to the baby, my granddaughter who hadn't even been born yet. I held the papers in my hands and sighed softly. "Let me read this first." Linda laughed lightly. "Oh, Emily, you don't need to read all that complicated legal stuff." But I read it anyway, slowly, carefully. The words blurred together sometimes, but one sentence stood out clearly. "Authority to manage, mortgage, sell, or transfer the property." My heart skipped. Mortgage, sell. I looked up at Michael. "Why would you need the power to sell the house?" Michael shrugged casually. "It's just standard legal wording." Linda waved her hand dismissively. "Exactly, it doesn't mean anything." I stared at both of them for a long moment. Something felt wrong, very wrong. "I need a few days to think," I said finally. Linda's smile disappeared again. "A few days," she repeated sharply. Michael squeezed her hand as if to calm her. "It's fine," he said, but his voice sounded tight. They left the papers on the table when they walked out. That night I sat alone in the kitchen staring at the yellow folder. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Every few minutes I turned a page, trying to understand the legal language, but my mind kept drifting back to the same thought. Why did they need so much control? 2 days later, my neighbor Mrs. Robinson came by with a pot of chicken soup. She took one look at my face and said, "Emily, what's wrong?" I told her everything: the money, the house, the papers on the table. She listened quietly while stirring her tea. When I finished, she placed the cup down firmly. "Don't sign that," she said immediately. I looked at her in surprise. "But Michael is my son." She leaned closer and squeezed my hand. "And that's exactly why you need to be careful." I didn't sleep much that night. My thoughts kept circling the same question over and over. Was I protecting my family or slowly losing everything? And what happened a week later would answer that question in a way I never expected, because eventually I did sign those papers. And the moment I wrote my name at the bottom of that document, I unknowingly handed my son the power to destroy my life. The day I signed those papers was strangely quiet. The sky was clear, the air warm, and everything looked completely normal, which somehow made the moment feel even more unsettling. Michael arrived early in the morning with Linda beside him. She wore a pale blue dress and held her purse tightly against her chest. Michael smiled when he saw me open the door, but it was a quick smile, the kind people use when they are trying to hide nervousness. "Morning, Mom," he said casually. "Ready to go?" I nodded slowly. My hands felt colder than usual even though the sun was shining. "Yes, I suppose so." We drove together to the notary office downtown. The car ride was quiet except for the soft sound of the radio playing an old song I barely noticed. Linda kept looking at her phone while Michael focused on the road. I stared out the window watching familiar streets pass by, the bakery where Richard used to buy bread every Sunday, the small park where Michael learned to ride his first bicycle. It felt strange, like I was watching pieces of my life slowly move away behind the car. When we arrived at the office, the notary greeted us politely and asked us to sit. He was an older man with glasses and a calm voice that echoed softly in the quiet room. He adjusted the documents on the table and began reading them aloud, long sentences filled with complicated words. Legal phrases that sounded cold and distant. I tried to listen carefully, but my mind kept drifting. Finally, he looked up and asked the question that mattered most. Mrs. Carter, do you understand that by signing this document you are granting your son full authority to manage your property? I glanced at Michael. He smiled reassuringly, the same smile he used as a child when asking permission for something. Yes, I said quietly. And are you signing of your own free will without pressure? The notary asked. My throat tightened slightly. I nodded. Yes, that was the second lie I told that day. I signed my name 3 times, Emily Carter, widow. The pen felt heavy in my hand as if the ink itself carried weight. When I finished, Linda clapped softly with a bright little laugh. See, that wasn't so hard. The notary stamped the papers with a loud thump and handed copies to Michael. Linda quickly slipped them into her purse. Now everything will be much easier, she said cheerfully. I forced a small smile, though something inside me felt uneasy, like a door had just closed somewhere deep in my life. As we walked outside, the sunlight hit my face and for a moment I felt dizzy. When should I start packing? I asked quietly. Michael looked confused. Packing, for the apartment, I explained. If you're moving into the house. Michael and Linda exchanged a quick glance before he answered. Oh, that can wait. We have a few things to arrange first. What things? I asked. Linda waved her hand dismissively. Baby things. You know, furniture, decorations, all that. They drove away soon after, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with a strange feeling in my chest. I held my copy of the document in my hands and sighed deeply. I had done it. I had trusted my son. I told myself everything would be fine, but sometimes life waits patiently before revealing the consequences of our choices. The first few weeks after signing the document were quiet. I called Michael several times to ask about the baby, about the house, about their plans. Most of the time I received short answers. We're busy, Mom. We'll talk later. Don't worry about it. Slowly the distance between us grew wider. One afternoon I decided to visit them without warning. I knocked on their apartment door 3 times before Linda finally opened it slightly. Her hair looked perfect, her nails freshly painted. Oh, Emily, she said with a faint sigh. What are you doing here? I just came to see you both, I replied softly, and maybe talk about the house. Linda hesitated before opening the door a little more. Inside the apartment, I noticed something surprising. Boxes everywhere, new furniture, baby clothes stacked neatly on the couch, expensive decorations still wrapped in plastic. I frowned slightly. Where did all this come from? Linda smiled proudly. From the bank, I repeated slowly. Yes, she said casually. Michael took out a mortgage on your house. For a moment the room spun around me. A mortgage? My voice came out barely above a whisper. Linda nodded, completely calm. $100,000. Enough to get everything ready for the baby. My hands began to shake. Michael did what? Just then I heard the television in the living room and saw my son sitting on the couch with a beer in his hand. He didn't even look surprised to see me. Hi, Mom, he said lazily. I stepped toward him, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. Is it true? I asked. Did you mortgage my house? Michael shrugged and took another sip of his beer. We needed the money. But that house is mine, I cried. He finally looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not guilt, not regret. Just annoyance. Not anymore, Mom. You signed the power of attorney, remember? My legs felt weak. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself. You promised. You said it was only for renovations. Linda crossed her arms and laughed softly. Oh, Emily, you really should read documents more carefully. My chest tightened painfully. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. 40 years of work gone with one signature. And the worst part was realizing something that hurt even more than the betrayal. My son wasn't even ashamed. He sat there drinking his beer like nothing had happened. That moment, that exact moment, was when I realized the terrible truth. I had not simply trusted my son. I had given him the power to destroy everything I had built. And the nightmare was only beginning. Because what happened in the months after that would push our family to a place I never imagined possible. A place where love turned into fear, and where one afternoon my own son would stand in my kitchen holding a belt, demanding that I sign another document. But before that terrible day arrived, something even more painful entered my life. My granddaughter Valerie. When I walked out of that apartment building that afternoon, I felt like the ground under my feet had disappeared. The sun was still shining, people were walking on the sidewalk, cars were passing by, everything looked normal. But inside me something had shattered. My house, the house Richard and I spent 40 years paying for, the house where my son grew up, mortgaged without even telling me. I remember sitting in my car for a long time staring at the steering wheel. My hands were trembling so badly I had to take several deep breaths just to calm down. How could he do this? I whispered to myself. But deep down, I already knew the answer. I had allowed it, I had signed the papers, I had trusted him, and now I was paying the price. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur. I stayed in the house, but it no longer felt like my home. Every time I looked at the walls, I remembered Linda's words, $100,000. Sometimes at night, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, wondering how my life had reached this point. I kept hoping Michael would call me and apologize. I kept hoping he would show some sign that he regretted what he had done, but the phone stayed silent. One evening, about a month later, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw a photo that made my heart stop. It was Linda in a hospital bed holding a tiny baby wrapped in a pink blanket. The caption read, "Welcome to the world, Valerie Carter." Valerie, my granddaughter. My hands started shaking again. I hadn't even known the baby was born. Hundreds of people were commenting under the photo. Hearts, congratulations, smiling faces, strangers celebrating the arrival of a child while the child's own grandmother had found out through social media. I covered my mouth and whispered, "Oh, my sweet girl." Tears rolled down my cheeks before I even realized I was crying. That night I barely slept. The thought of my granddaughter kept spinning in my mind. I needed to see her. I needed to hold her. The next morning I bought a small teddy bear and wrapped it in pink paper. It wasn't expensive, but I chose it carefully. A soft little bear with a tiny ribbon around its neck. I drove to Michael and Linda's apartment and knocked on the door. No answer. I knocked again, still nothing, but then I heard a faint sound inside, a baby crying. My heart squeezed painfully. "Michael, Linda, it's me," I called through the door. Finally, the door opened just a small crack and Linda's eye appeared in the gap. "What do you want, Emily?" she asked coldly. "I just came to meet my granddaughter," I said softly, holding up the gift. She sighed loudly. "This isn't a good time. Please," I whispered, "just 1 minute." Linda stared at me for a moment, then slowly opened the door. The apartment looked messy inside, dirty dishes on the table, clothes on the floor, curtains closed. The air smelled like sour milk and baby powder. "She's in the bedroom," Linda said flatly. My heart started beating faster as I walked down the hallway. When I pushed the bedroom door open, I saw the crib immediately. Inside it lay the smallest, most beautiful baby I had ever seen, dark hair. Tiny fingers curled beside her face. She was sleeping peacefully. For a moment I just stood there staring at her, unable to move. "She's beautiful," I whispered. Linda leaned against the doorframe behind me. "She looks like Michael. Can I hold her?" I asked carefully. Linda hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine." I lifted the baby gently from the crib and held her close to my chest. She smelled like milk and baby lotion. When her eyes opened, she looked at me for a few seconds and then she smiled. Oh, that tiny smile pierced straight through my heart. "Hello, little Valerie," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I'm your grandma." I stayed there for hours that day. I washed dishes, cleaned the kitchen, heated bottles, changed diapers. Linda mostly stayed in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone. When Michael finally came home late that evening, he looked surprised to see me. "Mom, what are you doing here?" he asked. "Helping," I replied simply. He looked around the apartment, now clean and quiet. "Thanks," he muttered. It was the first time in weeks he had said anything kind to me. That small word warmed my heart more than it should have. "Do you want to stay for dinner?" he asked awkwardly. I nodded with a small smile. "I'd love to." That night we ate together for the first time in months. The conversation was quiet, but something inside me felt hopeful again. When I left, Michael walked me to the door. "Mom, could you come tomorrow too?" he asked. "Linda is exhausted." My heart melted instantly. "Of course," I said. And just like that, I became their daily helper. Every morning I arrived at 8. Every evening I left around 8. I cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and took care of Valerie. Linda spent most of the day watching television or shopping online. Michael came home late almost every night, smelling like cigarettes and beer. At first I didn't mind. I was happy just to be close to my granddaughter. Holding Valerie made everything else feel less painful. But then one night something happened that changed everything again. I was putting Valerie to sleep when a piece of paper slipped from under the crib. I picked it up and looked at it under the lamplight. It was a notice from the bank. My heart sank as I read the words, "Mortgage payment overdue. 3 months unpaid." 3 months. They hadn't paid the mortgage for 3 months. My hands started shaking again. Suddenly I understood something terrifying. They weren't just using my house for money, they were about to lose it completely. And the next morning, when I confronted Michael about that paper, the conversation that followed pushed our relationship to a place so dark I never imagined we could reach it. The next morning, I arrived at the apartment earlier than usual. My heart was still pounding from what I had read the night before. That paper from the bank kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. 3 months overdue. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined strangers coming to my house, putting up a sign in the yard, taking everything that Richard and I had built together. When I knocked on the door that morning, Michael opened it while adjusting his jacket. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. Morning, Mom, he said quickly, grabbing his keys. I'm running late for work. Michael, I said firmly, stepping inside, we need to talk. My voice must have sounded different because he stopped immediately and frowned. What about? Linda appeared from the bedroom wearing a loose robe, her hair messy but her expression sharp. Why are you shouting? She asked irritably. I took the folded paper from my purse and placed it on the table. What is this? Michael glanced at it for barely a second before shrugging. A bank notice. I know it's a bank notice, I said, my voice shaking. It says you haven't paid the mortgage for 3 months. The room went silent for a moment. Linda crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. Michael rubbed his forehead with his hand. We'll handle it, he muttered. My chest tightened. Handle it how? I asked. Michael, if the bank doesn't get the money, they can take the house. He let out a frustrated sigh. Mom, it's not your problem. Those words hit me like a slap. Not my problem, I repeated slowly. That house is mine. Michael suddenly raised his voice. No, it's not. You signed it over to me, remember? Valerie started crying in the bedroom from the sudden shouting. The sound of my granddaughter's tiny cries filled the apartment like a painful echo. Linda walked toward the bedroom, but before entering she turned to me with a cold expression. You really should stop making things worse, Emily. Worse, I whispered. I'm trying to protect the house. She scoffed quietly. You mean control it? My heart sank deeper with every word. Michael grabbed his keys again. I'm late, he said impatiently. We'll talk about this later. No, I said firmly, my voice surprised even me. It sounded stronger than I expected. We're talking about it now. Michael stopped at the door and turned slowly. For a moment I saw anger flash in his eyes, real anger. What do you want me to say? He snapped. That we spent too much money, that things got out of control. Fine, happy now? I swallowed hard. I want to know if the house is going to be taken by the bank. Linda stepped back into the room holding Valerie in her arms. The baby was still whimpering softly. Emily, she said coldly, rocking the baby slightly, if you keep stressing us like this we might have to rethink how often you visit. My heart skipped. What does that mean? She smiled faintly. It means Valerie needs a calm environment. My stomach twisted immediately. I understood the threat behind those words. If I caused problems, they could stop me from seeing my granddaughter. And they knew exactly how much that would hurt me. I looked at Valerie's tiny face and felt tears burning in my eyes. I'm not trying to cause problems, I said quietly. I'm trying to help. Michael shook his head. Then help by trusting me. Trusting you, I whispered. You mortgaged my house without telling me. His jaw tightened. You gave me the power to do it. For a moment no one spoke. The tension in the room felt thick like heavy fog. Finally Linda broke the silence. Emily, she said calmly, maybe you should focus on what really matters. She gently kissed the top of Valerie's head. Your granddaughter. I looked at the baby again. My heart melted instantly. That tiny girl had done nothing wrong. She deserved a safe home, loving parents, a peaceful life. And somehow they had turned her into a weapon against me. I lowered my eyes and nodded slowly. All right, I said softly. I won't bring it up again. Michael relaxed slightly and grabbed his jacket. Good, he said, already heading for the door, but as he left I noticed something in his expression, relief mixed with something darker. Something that looked almost like victory. The apartment grew quiet after he left. Linda placed Valerie back in the crib and walked past me without saying a word. I stayed there for several minutes staring at the same bank notice still lying on the table. My hands trembled again as I picked it up and folded it carefully. At that moment I realized something important. If I kept staying silent, they would destroy everything. Not just my house, my future, maybe even their own lives too. That afternoon, while Valerie slept in my arms, I stepped quietly into the kitchen and took out my phone. My fingers hovered over a number I hadn't called in years. Ernest Miller, the lawyer who handled Richard's will when he died. A good man, honest, the kind of person who didn't look the other way when something was wrong. My heart pounded as the phone rang. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Finally, his calm voice answered. Miller and Associates. I swallowed hard before speaking. Hello, Mr. Miller, this is Emily Carter. There was a brief pause, then his tone softened with recognition. Emily, it's been a long time. How are you? I looked toward the bedroom where my granddaughter slept peacefully, unaware of the storm surrounding her life. A tear rolled slowly down my cheek. Honestly, I whispered, I'm not well. And I think I need your help. That phone call, the one I made that afternoon while holding my granddaughter, would change everything. Because from that moment on, the quiet suffering I had endured for months slowly turned into something else. Something stronger, something dangerous. And it would eventually lead to the most terrifying moment of my life, the afternoon when my own son walked into my house holding a belt in his hand, demanding that I sign another document or lose everything forever. The moment I hung up the phone after speaking with Mr. Miller, my hands were still shaking. My heart was beating so loudly I could almost hear it echoing inside my chest. For months I had been quiet. For months I had tried to keep peace, to avoid arguments, to protect what little connection I still had with my son and my granddaughter. but that phone call changed something inside me. It was the first time I admitted the truth out loud. I was being taken advantage of, and saying it felt both terrifying and strangely relieving. That afternoon, I stayed in the apartment until evening like I always did. I fed Valerie, changed her diaper, washed the dishes stacked in the sink, and folded laundry while Linda scrolled through her phone on the couch. Every few minutes she laughed softly at something on the screen. "Ha ha ha, oh my God," she said at one point, completely ignoring the baby crying in the crib beside her. I picked Valerie up and rocked her gently against my chest. "It's all right, little one," I whispered. "Grandma's here." Sometimes I wondered if Linda even realized how much time she spent ignoring her own child, but I kept my thoughts to myself. I had learned by then that speaking honestly only created more problems. When Michael came home later that evening, he looked irritated the moment he saw me. "Mom, you're still here?" he asked while loosening his tie. "I was helping with Valerie," I replied calmly. Linda shrugged from the couch. "She loves doing it." Michael nodded slowly but didn't smile. He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge, grabbing a beer before sitting down at the table. The room felt tense again, like a storm quietly building behind the walls. I wondered if he somehow sensed that I had spoken to a lawyer earlier that day. Of course he didn't know, but sometimes guilt makes people suspicious even when there is no evidence. A few minutes later, I gathered my purse and walked toward the door. "I'll come tomorrow morning like usual," I said softly. Michael looked up and shrugged. "Sure." Linda didn't even glance at me. I drove home that night with a strange mixture of fear and determination twisting inside me. My house looked exactly the same when I arrived, the porch light glowing softly. The lilac bush outside the window moving gently in the evening breeze, but the feeling inside the house had changed. I walked slowly through each room again, just like I had weeks earlier. The living room, the kitchen. The hallway where Michael used to race his toy cars along the floor. I stopped in front of the old family photo hanging near the stairs. Richard stood beside me in the picture, smiling proudly with his arm around my shoulders while young Michael sat between us. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the photo. "I should have listened to you." That night Mr. Miller called me back. His voice sounded serious. "Emily, I've reviewed what you told me earlier. This situation is very concerning." I sat down at the kitchen table and held the phone tightly. "What can I do?" I asked quietly. "First," he said, "we need to revoke that power of attorney immediately." My heart skipped. "Revoke it?" "Yes," he explained. "You granted it. That means you can cancel it. But once you do, your son will lose the legal authority to act on your behalf." I hesitated. The thought of Michael discovering that I had revoked his power made my stomach twist with anxiety. "He's going to be furious," I said softly. Mr. Miller sighed gently. "Emily, I understand that he is your son. But right now he is using that document to put your entire future at risk." His words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. I barely slept that night. My thoughts kept racing between two fears: losing my house or losing my son completely. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual and dressed carefully. A simple navy dress, the same one I wore to Michael's wedding. Somehow it made me feel stronger. When I arrived at Mr. Miller's office downtown, he greeted me warmly but with serious eyes. His office smelled faintly of old books and coffee. We sat down together while he organized several documents on his desk. "Emily," he said calmly, "are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" I took a deep breath and nodded slowly. Yes. The process itself was surprisingly simple. A few signatures, a few stamps. Within minutes, the power of attorney that had allowed my son to control everything was gone, just like that. As we walked outside afterward, the midday sun felt unusually bright on my face. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Mr. Miller adjusted his glasses and looked at me carefully. "Now we wait." "For what?" I asked. "For your son to react." His answer made a chill run through my body, because deep down I already knew something about Michael's temper. When he felt cornered, he didn't stay calm, he exploded. That evening the phone rang while I was making tea. I looked at the screen and saw his name, Michael. My hands froze for a moment before answering. "Hello," I said softly. His voice came through the phone like thunder. "What did you do?" My heart jumped. "Michael, you revoked the power of attorney," he shouted. "Are you trying to ruin us?" I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. "I'm protecting my house." "Your house?" he snapped bitterly. "You mean the house we're paying for?" "You haven't paid anything," I said quietly. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted only a second before his voice came back colder than ever. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Mom." The line went dead. I stood there holding the phone long after the call ended, my hands trembling again because something in Michael's voice had changed. It wasn't frustration anymore. It was anger, real anger, and deep down I knew that phone call had just set something terrible in motion. 3 days later, while I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, I heard the front door open. Not a knock, not a doorbell. Just the sound of a key turning in the lock. My heart stopped, then I heard Michael's voice in the living room. "Mom, we need to talk." And when I walked into the kitchen doorway and saw him standing there, holding a belt in his hand, I realized the nightmare I feared had finally arrived. When I stepped into the living room and saw Michael standing there, my heart dropped straight into my stomach. For a moment I thought I was imagining things. Maybe I was still half asleep, maybe this was some strange nightmare. But no, he was really there. My son, standing in the middle of my house with his jaw clenched and anger burning in his eyes, and in his hand he was holding a black leather belt. Behind him stood Linda, calm as ever, holding little Valerie in her arms. The baby looked around curiously, unaware of the tension filling the room. "Michael," I whispered, my voice barely steady. "Why are you here?" He took a slow step forward, the belt dangling loosely from his hand. "You know why I'm here." My chest tightened. I already understood what this was about. "I told you on the phone," he continued, his voice sharp. "You made a huge mistake." Linda shifted Valerie slightly on her hip and sighed like someone watching a boring argument. "Honestly, Emily," she said calmly, "you really shouldn't have involved lawyers." My hands trembled slightly as I placed the coffee cup on the table. "I was protecting myself." Michael laughed once, a short, bitter laugh. "Protecting yourself from what? Your own family?" That word, family, felt like a knife twisting slowly inside my chest. For a few seconds no one spoke. The house felt strangely quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Michael reached into his jacket pocket and threw a stack of papers onto the kitchen table. The sound made me jump slightly. "Sign it," he said. I stared at the documents. I didn't even need to read them to know what they were. Another power of attorney, another attempt to take control of everything. "No," I said quietly. His expression hardened instantly. "Mom, don't start this again." Linda let out a soft laugh behind him. "Ha ha ha, look at her face." She leaned slightly toward Michael and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. "She still thinks she has a choice." My stomach twisted painfully. I looked at my granddaughter again. Valerie's tiny fingers were wrapped around the sleeve of Linda's robe, her big eyes watching everything with innocent curiosity. I took a deep breath and spoke slowly. "I'm not signing anything." Michael's grip on the belt tightened, the leather creaked slightly in his hand. "You don't understand the situation," he said through clenched teeth. "If you don't sign that, the bank will take the house." "That's not my fault," I replied quietly. "You took the mortgage." His face turned red with anger. "I did it for us," I whispered. "Or for yourself," Linda rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh please, can we stop pretending this is some big moral drama?" she said with a sigh. "It's just money." Then she smiled in a way that made my blood run cold. "And technically it's already ours anyway." My heart pounded louder with every second. "You're wrong," I said softly. "That house belongs to me." Michael suddenly slammed his hand against the table. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. Valerie started crying in Linda's arms. "Enough," he shouted. For a moment I thought he might actually hit the table again, but instead he slowly lifted the belt in his hand. The leather hung there, dark and heavy. "Mom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet now, "I'm asking you one last time." My throat felt tight, but I forced myself to answer. "No." Linda took a step backward while rocking the crying baby gently. "Wow," she murmured sarcastically. "Look at that, Grandma has courage." Michael's breathing became heavier. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly. The belt wrapped tighter around his fist as his knuckles turned white. "Don't make me do something we'll both regret," he said slowly. Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to look away. "You already have." For a second something flickered across his face. Maybe guilt, maybe hesitation. But it disappeared almost immediately. He raised the belt slightly. My heart felt like it stopped beating. I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered quietly, "Richard, help me." Behind Michael I heard Linda whisper impatiently, "Just do it." "She's bluffing." My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to stand still. I wasn't going to sign, not again, not even if he scared me. Michael lifted the belt higher, and just as I braced myself for what might happen next, a sudden sound echoed through the house. Ding-dong, the doorbell. Michael froze instantly. The belt remained hanging in the air while all three of us stared toward the front door. For a few seconds no one moved, then the bell rang again. Ding-dong, ding-dong. Linda's eyes widened slightly. "Who is that?" she whispered. My heart was racing again, but now the fear felt different. Something about that sound felt like hope. Michael lowered the belt slowly, but his expression remained tense. "Don't open it," he said quickly. But my feet were already moving toward the door. "Mom," he snapped. "I said don't open it." I ignored him. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle. On the other side of the door someone knocked firmly. Knock, knock, knock. I took one deep breath, turned the handle, and opened the door. Linda screamed the moment she saw who was standing there, and in that instant, everything changed forever. When I opened the door, the first thing I saw was a familiar gray suit. Attorney Ernest Miller stood on the porch holding his leather briefcase. Beside him was a police officer in full uniform, tall and calm, his badge catching the afternoon sunlight. For a second I couldn't even speak, my throat tightened and tears immediately filled my eyes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carter," Mr. Miller said gently. "Is everything all right?" Behind me I heard Linda gasp loudly. "What is this?" she shouted. The baby in her arms began crying again, frightened by the sudden tension. The police officer stepped slightly forward and looked past me into the house. His eyes immediately landed on Michael and the belt still hanging from his hand. "Sir," the officer said calmly but firmly, "I need you to drop that." Michael froze like a statue. For a moment he looked from the officer to the lawyer and then back at me. His face had lost all color. Slowly, the belt slipped from his hand and fell to the kitchen floor with a dull slap. The sound echoed through the room like the end of something final. Linda tried to speak quickly, her voice shaking now. "This is a misunderstanding," she said nervously. "We were just talking." Mr. Miller stepped inside beside me and glanced at the belt on the floor. He sighed softly. "Talking with a weapon." The officer walked a few steps forward and stood between Michael and me. "Ma'am," he said kindly, "are you all right?" I nodded slowly even though my legs still felt weak. "Yes, I think so." Linda hugged Valerie closer and backed toward the wall. Her confident smile had completely disappeared. "Emily," she snapped, "what have you done?" But before I could answer, the officer picked up the papers from the table and looked at them carefully. "Another power of attorney," he said, raising an eyebrow. Mr. Miller adjusted his glasses and took the papers from him, and judging by the circumstances, he added calmly, "This appears to have been obtained under coercion." Michael suddenly found his voice again. "That's not true," he shouted. "We were just asking her to sign." I looked at him, my heart heavy with sadness. "With the belt in your hand," I whispered. The officer turned toward him with a serious expression. "Sir, threatening someone to force a legal signature is a criminal offense." The room went completely silent. Michael sank into the chair beside the table, covering his face with his hands. For the first time in months, I saw him cry. "Real tears. I didn't want it to go this far," he murmured. "We're desperate." Something inside my chest softened for a brief moment. He was still my son after all, the little boy I once carried in my arms. But then my eyes moved to the belt lying on the floor, and I remembered everything that had happened over the past months. The lies, the threats, the manipulation, the way they used my granddaughter against me. Mr. Miller cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Carter, you have two choices right now," he said. "You can leave peacefully and handle this matter in court, or Officer Martinez can place you under arrest." Linda immediately grabbed Michael's arm. "Let's go," she whispered urgently. Michael stood slowly, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He looked at me one last time. "Mom," he said quietly. My heart tightened again. For a moment I thought he might apologize. But instead he simply shook his head and walked toward the door. Linda followed quickly, carrying Valerie without even glancing at me. The front door closed behind them with a soft click. And just like that, the house became silent again. My legs finally gave out and I sank into the armchair near the window. Mr. Miller placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. I nodded slowly, though tears were still sliding down my cheeks. "It doesn't feel like it." The officer picked up the belt from the floor and placed it on the table as evidence. "We recommend changing the locks immediately," he said. "And we will also request a restraining order for your safety." A restraining order against my own son. Hearing those words felt like another small piece of my heart breaking. The following weeks passed quietly. The legal process began moving forward. Mr. Miller worked tirelessly, gathering documents and evidence to prove the mortgage had been taken under emotional manipulation. Eventually, the court ruled in my favor. The mortgage was canceled, the house was returned completely to my name, the bank absorbed the loss. In legal terms, I had won, but victory can feel strangely empty sometimes. Michael disappeared after the court hearing. Linda moved away with Valerie to live with her mother. I didn't see my granddaughter again after that day. Months later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from Michael. In it, he wrote that he was sorry for everything. Sorry for letting things go too far. He said he had lost his job, his marriage, and his home, and worst of all, he had lost his mother. I read that letter 3 times, tears falling onto the paper. But some things in life cannot simply be repaired with apologies. Trust, once broken deeply enough, rarely returns the same. Today I still live in the same house. The lilac bush outside the window still blooms every spring just like it did the day Michael was born. Sometimes I sit in the living room and think about the choices we make as parents, the love we give, the limits we fail to set, because love without boundaries can slowly turn into something dangerous, something that destroys both sides. If you have children, remember this: loving them doesn't mean giving them everything. Sometimes loving them means saying no, and if you've ever faced betrayal from someone you loved deeply, you are not alone. Life teaches hard lessons, but those lessons can also make us stronger. If this story touched you, or if you want to hear more real stories about family, choices, and the unexpected twists of life, make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay with us. There are many more stories waiting to be told, and some of them may remind you just how complicated the word family can truly be.